with my UCLA class, and we did a study on the pandemic that was really wonderful and soon proved to be, the students know what's going on. There were 7 students from 7 countries, and they really nailed it, and I'm very proud of my students. So
excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hari, why don't you introduce yourself? You're muted.
Sorry, good morning, everyone. I am like Malay, also from Santa Monica College. I teach English. None of my students is here this time. This is my first time. So I wanted to learn more about it before I invite them, but I will certainly share the experience with them. I teach a variety of composition and literature classes at SMC. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Hari. Carolyn, introduce yourself.
Hey there. I'm at College of Southern Maryland, and I'm seeing my esteemed colleague Maria Bryant here, who I haven't seen in a while. I've been at CSM for I don't know, decades, and I teach on the Leonardtown campus, which is one of the sort of the medium-sized of the 3. I guess we're 4 campuses now. You know, started off in languages and kind of moved into culture and communications. So I'm now doing communications, a bit of film, and have been doing a travel study with students to Belize for, I think it's been 15 years, I think. We were canceled last March.
Mm-hmm.
We're on the books for May. Hopefully that'll happen.
Okay, okay. Excellent. And you brought your niece yesterday.
I did. So she's a student in Tulsa who has almost the identical path that
Heather Payne. Yeah.
Heather, yeah.
Yeah.
So she went to Tulsa Community College, and then is now in Oklahoma City.
Okay. So hopefully they can connect.
So it's kind of amazing.
So she should connect up with Heather, really.
I sure hope so.
Yeah, yeah. All right, I'm going to keep going because we're starting, but I want to get all these introductions in, and I know we started a little bit before. Jillian, why don't you introduce yourself? And we don't see you. You don't have your camera. There you are. How you doing?
My breakfast.
That's okay. That's okay. Eating is not rude.
Okay. So yes, hello, good morning, everybody. So I'm with Germanna Community College. I've been teaching there, Administration of Justice, and also teach at Avery University, Business. And I'm also a student at the University of Cincinnati. And I guess I'm one of those students that have been in school for like forever, since the 80s. So I'm still trying to finish up this second master's, but I'm hoping that I'll get there. So glad to be here.
It's great. And Germanna's in Virginia. So I'm just kind of counting the states that we've got. We've got a number of states here. Joanne, you want to introduce yourself? Joanne Ivory.
Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry, like everybody else, I'm trying to eat and multitask. Right. Joanne Ivory, I am the Dean of Career and Technical Programs at Harper College.
Excellent. Thank you. Glad you're here. Rebecca, I'm just kind of keep going along here. Next one on my screen. Rebecca, yes, introduce yourself.
Hi. Hold on, let me fix my mic here. Here we go. I am a student of Dr. Bowman at Austin Community College.
Excellent. Excellent. Glad you're here. Olivia.
Hi, good morning. My name is Olivia Vallejo. I'm a counselor at Santa Monica College, and I teach Counseling 20.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Sarah, you brought some folks with you, so introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Sarah Bowman. I'm the program coordinator at Austin Community College and for Peace and Conflict Studies. And I also teach humanities, communications, sometimes English, and maybe moving into game design. We'll see.
Very cool. Amy?
Good morning. I'm the Global Studies Coordinator at Austin Community College, and I teach in sociology and student development.
Excellent, thank you. Stacy.
Hi, good morning. So I'm Stacy Moreno, and I currently I'm living in New Jersey, but I teach in Arizona, is social work. Yes, I'm a social worker. I teach in the social work program. I'm also in the middle of obtaining a second master's in human rights practice. And additionally, I create and lead global learning programs abroad and virtually. We're piloting some things right now too.
Okay, great, thank you. And we haven't talked in a while, so I'm glad that you're here.
Yeah, it's been a while, yeah.
Yeah, Sarah. Sarah D.
Sorry, I thought I was unmuted. Hi guys, this is Sarah D. I am in a bit of transition at the moment, but most recently I was working in community college, institutional effectiveness, and also in peace studies and research methods around peace studies. I finished my doctorate out in LA last May and just relocated to the East Coast, and am now kind of in pursuit of something else, but also hosting some anti-racism book and discussion groups for teenagers and adults. So I'm really excited about this conference. It's coming at a great time.
Great, great. So I'm going to ask Samuel in a minute, but I want to say a couple things, just housekeeping and for you to think about as we keep going. One is, I'd ask everybody, you should be able to make sure that your name is clear on your screen, like put your first name, last name, or just your first, or however you want to be addressed. Even if you feel you want to put your pronouns, please do that also. Because some people have got like their first initial last name. So if I want people to be able to talk to each other, and certainly the presenters. The other thing is that, and this is really your preference. I've been a lot of online conferences lately, and I really have a preference for running the video, for showing me. I'm wondering if I don't want to move into kind of an anonymous world where it's just your name and a black screen. One of the reasons that I do it is maybe it may not be so comforting to do it, but if you'd gone to a real conference, it's not like you would have been under a black screen, we'd have seen you. But I actually think it helps presenter performances that they can see people and see how they're reacting and seeing those types of things. So that's why I'm encouraging that. If you prefer not to, if you're doing a lot of fiddling with your hair or whatever, if you're eating, but we would eat in conferences and people would see us, so why not here, right? Kind of a thing. All right, let me keep going, introducing people. I'm going along here. Next one, Susan, introduce yourself if you can. Then I'll keep going along.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Susan Cushman. I teach at Nassau Community College out in Garden City, Long Island, New York. My degrees are in literature, and women's studies, and I've kind of migrated to human rights and peace studies through the back door of women and gender studies, and I'm loving it. It's just like my new love.
Great.
Yep, thank you.
Another state, New York. Samuel.
Good morning. Great to see everyone. I'm Samuel Echevarria Cruz. I'm here in Austin, working at Austin Community College District, professor of sociology, and enjoying this experience so far.
Great, thank you. So have I missed anybody? I'm wanting to make sure. I've got 25 participants in, and it looks like I've had everybody a chance to introduce themselves. If people come in late, after Daryn is going to start in about 5 minutes or so, then we'll do it after Daryn's presentation and do that. You know, one of the things I ask for everybody's indulgence and forgiveness, and how this may seem rocky sometime in the transitioning. This morning there were a group of you that got together about 11:30, and I want to encourage that. That's really the chance for us to kind of have the chit chat and the talking. Between breaks, we'll try to do that, and we'll try to have time for questions also. The other thing is that there's been some questions about the recording, because we are recording this, but I'm probably going to embargo the recordings till after the conference. So after the conference, then it'll be available to everybody at that point. I've got to talk to Catherine and figure out how exactly we're going to do that. We'll do that afterwards. Also, so after today, we will not get together until next Friday again. And you can look at the schedule. Next Friday, we have Anna Cutter-Patel from Outward Bound Peacebuilding and Dave Ragland from the Truth Telling Project on Friday. And then we've got Kim Romano, Patricia Romano, Kim Simmerd from Resist Violence Project, and then Julia Delafield from University for Peace, and Katie Zanoni and Fran Ferres. So we've got a lot going on next Saturday also, so that you know that it's a little bit longer next Saturday. But between now and next week, I'm not very sophisticated with this, so I tend to use email. And so there's an email group, you're all on it. We all are educators, so you know we're busy in our classes and so forth. But feel free to talk to each other during the week. And if you want to put something in the email that you say to me, you say, David, can we talk about this next week? We'll figure out how to fit it in, right? One of the things that I do want to talk about, because it was raised this morning, is for us to think about this is a very stressful week for people, and it's a significant week for our country, the world, our discipline. Any way you cut it, it's significant. So talking a little bit about how we are going to think about working with our students, and come Tuesday or come Wednesday, how we are looking at the role that we play in our classrooms, I think would be well worth addressing. So we'll address it at a certain point. We may address it at break. Maybe we'll address it inside of a conversation. We'll do that. Keep putting questions in the chat box, which I'll answer as I get through it. There are a couple other people who have joined us, I see, and I just want to give them a chance to introduce themselves quickly, and then I'm going to really introduce Daryn, and we're going to go into the first session. So Sue, could you introduce yourself? Sue B.
Hi there, I'm Sue
Hi.
Borchek-Smith from Harper College in Palatine. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Thank you, Rich Johnson. Thank you, presenters yesterday. I'm a first-time college graduate, first-time master's degree, so I especially enjoyed some of your presentations yesterday. It's inspiring, and I think that even though some of us do this a little bit later, I'm hoping we can still create some change.
Great,
So thank you so much. I work in student involvement.
That's great, great.
Thank you.
And Fran, introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Fran Faraz, and I teach Peace Studies, several courses in Peace Studies at Golden West College. I'm also the director of the program, offering fellowships in Peace Studies, offering peace conferences, and many other events, seminars, and events on campus or community-wide. I'm so happy to be here. I've known David for several years, and he was very instrumental in for me to have the confidence to keep going with and insisting that we have to have a Peace Studies program at the college, and eventually I became a full-time faculty there. So thank you so much, David, for a great program that you have put together always, and I enjoyed it last year as I came to the seminar to DC, and this format is also offering a great value. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Fran. You're very kind, and it's really a pleasure working with you. So I'm really glad to be with all of you. You all inspire me. I must tell you, this is truly the highlight of the work that I do. My work is kind of wide-ranging in the many things that I do, but for me, everything is contextualized in the 10 years I was at Harvard Community College. I don't know how many of you know my background, and you can read it, and I'll share a little bit more at a certain point, but I spent 10 years in a community college. That was my first love. That's where I felt I was most effective in working with students. And I was full-time and tenured, and that's where I went on a Fulbright. So this is always where I come back to, is my community college colleagues and working with them. So I'm glad to be here this morning. So I'm going to go ahead and transition over to Daryn. Daryn, I've made you a co-host. You should be able to see that. So really anything that you can do, I can do, you can do. It should be that way. And Daryn, you basically have the floor until 1 presentation-wide, but we can go to 1:15 with questions before Jess Bonnan-White joins us. I'm going to abbreviate. I'm giving a more personalized introduction to Daryn than a more, we'll say, biographical. I'm not going to tell you where he went to school and all that stuff. Daryn is just a wonderful, generous guy, and I really love working with Daryn over the years. Daryn and I didn't cross at the same time at USIP. He came after I'd left, but I'd met Daryn before then and just working in peace education. He's also from the DC area, lives in Northern Virginia, and from the time that we started this, the first time we did this was at Montgomery College in 2013. Daryn has basically come every year, and and talked about peace education and provide this context for everyone. This year, I've asked Daryn to think in terms of what's going on in our world today. So it's not that it's going to be any more or less, but I do want to make it sure that I've been intentional in thinking about the world that we live in. And we have all these existential things going on. One is the whole issue about social justice and Black Lives Matter. Daryn and I actually presented a couple of weeks ago at Harrisburg Area Community College. And the other is the pandemic also. Actually, we're going to have a speaker from the New Jersey Institute of Human Rights in the last weekend who's going to talk about the effects of the pandemic on Black and brown populations. And you may be seeing this with your own students. So we're going to come back to that. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Daryn and leave you in his trusty hands. So Daryn, welcome this morning. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thanks, David, for that. And thanks for always inviting me to be a part of this experience. It also is a highlight of my year and my work. So I really appreciate it. And I enjoy seeing all your faces, reading all your names. It's good to meet all of you. I liked hearing your backgrounds and your introductions. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let me know if you all are able to see that. It should say, what is the beloved community anyway? Give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Okay, great. So as David said, I've been in the peace education field for a while and in a variety of capacities. So I'll share a little bit about my story. Right now I work for an organization called Training Resources Group. We provide education, training, and organizational development for a variety of clients. And currently I support the U.S. Agency for International Development, their Office of Education, and all the foreign service officers and foreign service nationals that manage education programs and try and provide quality access to education for all children and youth. So that's been kind of the focus of a lot of my energy these last couple of years. And then I've also been teaching at American University for several years, peace education being one of the subject matters. So the outline for what we're going to do today is we'll do a little seeding. I'm going to share a couple quotes with you all that I want you to keep in your mind and in your head as we go through the presentation. And as the title said, you know, what is the beloved community anyway? It's a term that Dr. King and many others in the civil rights movement in the social justice world have used. But oftentimes I think it goes like right over people's heads, like, wait, what does that mean anyway? And I think really bringing that term and that phrase beloved community forward and spending time defining it and talking about how we can contribute to it is more important now than ever, given all the things that David had said. So we'll touch on that a little bit. And I think we're going to dive into your stories and how you're contributing to that beloved community. I'll share a little bit about my journey as a peace builder. I think our knowledge comes from our experience. My perspective comes from my experiences. So I wanted to just share a couple like highlights or chapters from my career as a peace builder. We'll do a little myth busting and truth telling. Again, also really important in this day and age when our ideas that maybe at one time we held as very firm and true start to feel like they're eroding on the edges. I think it's at those times where we need to revisit the science and the work that has been put into informing how we operate as human beings and what that means for peace and justice and war and violence. And throughout all this is going to be engaging and participatory. So I'll be presenting some, but there's going to be activities interspersed throughout all of this. So please, some of these activities will require that you have your phone. So if you don't have your phone near you, go and grab it and have it close to you. It would be helpful to have a piece of paper and a pen or pencil with you as well to jot down some notes and reflections, and be prepared. I'm going to call on you. There won't necessarily be a rhyme or reason to it, but I want to bring in your voices through a lot of this. So I'm happy that David had you all ensure that the name that is on your video file is the name that you want to be addressed by. So be prepared for that. You may be called on to share and unmute yourself. And if you're so inclined, turn on your camera so we can see you. And then we'll close with a reflection on, all right, well, what does this all mean and what are we walking away with? So the quote that I'm going to start with, the seed that I want to plant at the start of all this, is a quote from Reverend James Lawson. Some of you may be familiar with him. If you are not, Dr. King referred to Lawson as the mind of the movement, that being the civil rights movement. Reverend Lawson was a Methodist minister who in the 1950s traveled to India to study and learn with those who had organized, planned, marched, resisted with Mohandas Gandhi during India's independence. So this is a Black American religious figure learning from what they had done in India from those who did it alongside Gandhi to figure out what is this nonviolence thing that Gandhi, and again, this is 1950. This was not a widespread phenomenon, or at least it wasn't widely seen or focused on as much as it is today. Lawson comes back from the United States, and Dr. King hears of him and other Black religious and intellectuals who had gone there and said, nonviolence is a strategy that we can use here in the United States as African Americans, as Black people, to fight against the injustice that we face, the racism, the segregation, the Jim Crow. So Lawson, will you come and train us and teach us about the history, the strategy, the philosophy of nonviolence so that we can wage our struggle in that way? And he did, and King referred to him as the mind of the movement. Lawson is still alive today. He's a man in his late 80s. Those of you who watched the funeral of the late John Lewis, Lawson was one of the speakers at that ceremony because he trained John Lewis. And John Lewis has spoken about Reverend Lawson on countless occasions. Anyway, the quote reads, "We as a people do not yet have the world we are capable of having." Now, I heard John Lewis speak these words in person. A previous job, I had the privilege of working alongside Reverend Lawson. And when he said this at a conference workshop that we were doing, it just washed all over me. And my whole purpose in life was captured in that one small, short sentence, because it does two things. It acknowledges the challenges that we face in this world around oppression, hate, injustice, all of those things. And in the same breath, gives a sign of optimism, because it says we're living in a world that is not working for a lot of people, for far too many people, but we are capable as human beings of having something so much greater. And it's that potential capability that if we can tap into it, we can get there. And so I love that, because it's not 100% cynical. It's also not 100% idealistic. It's a mixture of the two, which I think is essential in the work that we do in the peace and justice field. So that takes us to then, what are we then capable of? And answers the question, what is the beloved community anyway? So the exercise that I want us to do here is, I'm not going to read this quote out loud. I am going to ask that you all read it to yourselves. And as you read this quote, you'll notice some of the phrases in this quote are written in yellow, and there's a number that comes before each of those bolded yellow phrases in the definition. This definition comes from the King Center, which is a great resource to go to. As you read this quote, I want you to think about the classes that you teach, or the programs that you direct or that you coordinate. And I want you to pick one of these phrases that you feel you contribute to in your capacity teaching a class or classes or directing a program or coordinating a program. And once you've identified just one of these phrases, I'm sure there's many, but I want you to just select just one where you can say, you know what, the work that I do contributes to, number one, creating this global vision and understanding what a global vision is. Yes, part of what I do contributes to that. If you feel that, I want you to type number one into the chat box, and that'll let me know that you selected number one. Number two, if you feel like the work that you do contributes to sharing in the wealth of the earth, then you put number two, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of a quick little poll that is going to allow you to kind of interact with this definition, and then it's going to let me know how I want to move forward with the activity. So go ahead now, take a minute or two, read the quote to yourself, select which phrase you contribute to, and put that in the chat, please. Okay, great. It looks like most everybody has put it in there, and it's a great mixture here. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this definition. I'm going to pause at each of these bolded yellow statements. I'm going to turn to somebody who says, yes, the work that I do contributes to that. And I'm going to have you briefly explain a little bit about how your work does that. So let's begin. What is the beloved community anyway? Well, Dr. King's beloved community is first a global vision. And Richard Johnson, I'd love for you to unmute yourself and tell us about how the work that you do contributes to this global vision.
Thank you, Daryn. So as the faculty director for international education, over the past 10 years, I've really focused on faculty, staff, professional development, curriculum infusion with global learning outcomes, and campus programming to develop, cultivate global competencies and promote global citizenship among the faculty, staff, and students of Harper College.
Wonderful. Thank you, Richard. So it creates this global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the world. And Jennifer Knowlton, you said that the work that you do contributes to sharing in the wealth of the world. Tell us how you do that.
I think just working at a community college is a big part of that, giving students, you know, a lot of people that college is a difficult feat to get to based on where they're coming from in life and their family situation, socioeconomic status. So working at a community college, I feel like we are giving much more of the population a chance for that education and for a future.
Love it. Thank you, Jennifer. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. And Paul Chapman, you talked about your work contributing to these international standards of human decency. Please tell us how you do that.
Sure. Thank you for letting me speak about it. It's hard to pick just one. Well, I have a unit in my Peace Studies class, a module that's about war and conflict and violence. And, you know, one of the easiest things to do is just ask people how they want to be treated. And what they say usually matches up with international, you know, standards of, law, of Declaration of Human Rights, you know, all of those types of things. And we have a couple of assignments that identify what those are and the origins of them. So I think that kind of fits the international standards of human decency.
Love it. Thank you, Paul. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. And Sue B., you talked about how you contribute to an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. Unmute yourself and tell us how you do that.
Thank you so much, Daryn. At Harper College and Student Involvement, we do offer quite a few clubs for students to get involved in that they can identify with and hopefully connect with their own background and their future and cross-connect with other clubs as well. We're also very strong about if there's not a club of interest, we encourage them to try to start a new one so that we're always open and welcome to everyone to be able to come together and share.
Great. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you.
In the beloved community, international disputes will be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation of adversaries. And Olivia Vallejo, you said that you contribute to this. Please unmute yourself and tell us how you do this work.
Hi, yeah, it's actually kind of funny because I was working this past week on my module on communication and conflict resolution, because we do talk about diversity and getting along with others and what's the best way to communicate. And a big part of that is how to resolve conflicts with each other.
Great, thank you, Olivia. So how do we do that instead of military power? And love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. And Suzanne, your work contributes to this. Please unmute yourself and tell us how you do this work.
Gently. That's a challenge. So again, I teach American government. So I try to call to their attention different sources that heighten fear and make them aware and more in tune to that. And I try to remind them that their neighbor is their neighbor, and their family members, you know, people who disagree with them are people they actually love. So I tried that. That's my only hope in my course in American government, because as a democracy, we have to all be in it together, and we're not there right now. So that's my goal. And I try gently each day to do that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Suzanne. Also, I love the painting behind you. And then the last sentence reads, peace with justice will prevail over war and military conflict. And Maria Bryant, your work contributes to this. Please unmute yourself and tell us how you do this work.
All right, so I wrote myself a couple of notes about that. One is assuring students the work they do is evaluated based on the merits of their work rather than political affiliation. So I think a lot of our students are concerned that if they are in a, in the political spectrum where they assume the instructor might not be, they feel like you might, use it against them. I think it's very important that you acknowledge that we have these differences and we measure and, evaluate them based on the merits of their work, regardless of political affiliation. And then the second part is, because I'm retiring or departing, is that sometimes, when you give up, it takes courage to do that. For some people, it's giving up. But when one leaves, the point that I'm leaving, I'm opening opportunities for others who can then be promoted, who can be put in that place.
Great. Thank you, Maria. And thanks to all of you, those who I called on, but also just your reflecting on this and posting your responses into the chat. And hopefully what this reveals, if it wasn't clear to you all already, is that we as individuals in our own specific ways, in our own context, and also we as a community can, and in this community in particular, we know that we are walking towards what Dr. King defined and described as this beloved community. So I encourage you all to maybe keep this quote top of mind. I will share a link to this entire presentation, but I also just put in the chat a link to the King Center where you can dive a little bit deeper into this concept of the beloved community, Dr. King's principles, 6 principles of nonviolence, 6 steps of nonviolent social change. There's so many resources online, obviously, about Dr. King for obvious reasons, but this is a good place to start. So I put that chat in the window, in the chat window. So thank you all for contributing to that. What I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna skip ahead a little bit. I'm not gonna really dive into my journey as a peace builder. We can take that in questions later. I mean, I can skip through some pictures here that'll give you a sense of some of the work or experiences that I've done, but I won't go into detail just in the interest of time. But this timeline is essentially, I've worked for a variety of different organizations, contributed to a variety of different workshops and trainings and courses, and I feel contributed to the peace and justice field in a variety of ways. Going back to that initial quote from Reverend Lawson is the belief that, yeah, things are not the way that they should be right now. And what can I do to get us to reach our actual human potential? So these are just some examples, and I'll dive a little bit deeper into these when we go into some of the activities and share some links to a couple of these as well. But in the interest of time, I'll move us forward. So I wanted to jump to the whole myth busting and truth telling aspect of this. And we're going to start by looking at the SEVILLE statement on violence. And I'm going to put a quote, a link to that actual statement into the chat so you can have that. And the SEVILLE statement on violence was crafted in 1986. 20 of the world's most gifted and brilliant scientists from a variety of different fields, biology, neurophysiology, sociology, anthropology, biology, they all came together to study this question around humanity and violence. And they wanted to test a lot of assumptions that people were spreading and sharing in terms of, why do people go to war? Why do people kill one another? Why is there this hatred that leads to violence and war and conflict? And they just kind of went untested. People just said these things and people were like, oh yeah, that's the way it is. And so the field of science, variety of fields of science came together and said, let's actually test these, you know? So what they did was they came out with this statement on violence. And the first myth they revealed is that there's this belief that in the course of human evolution, there has been a selection for aggressive behavior more than for other kinds of behavior. So this idea that like, oh yeah, you know, as we've evolved, the more aggressive members of our species are the ones that have survived. And so over generation and generation, we become more and more aggressive. That's a complete, total myth. So anytime you read that or someone references that, it's scientifically proven to be fundamentally wrong. What is the reality? And what is the approach that we take knowing what science tells us about human evolution? The reality is that when we look to more cooperative and less aggressive members of a group, when we're finding ways to maintain stability and ensure survival and wellness of a community, that's how we're successful. In fact, when we look at different evolution of species, it is the more aggressive members of a pack or a group that are actually marginalized because they disrupt the wellness and the cohesion and the stability of a community, not the opposite. And so an example, and I'll share, maybe I won't share this link, but an example from my work, this picture showed up earlier, is when I was at the United States Institute of Peace, we worked with a large community of Buddhist monks and nuns from Thailand and Cambodia and Sri Lanka and Vietnam. And they were putting together a curriculum because in the West, there's a sense that the Buddhist tradition and Buddhist countries and communities are very peaceful and mindfulness, and certainly that is a part of the Buddhist tradition. But in reality, Burma is one of the most violent plagued countries in the entire world, and that is a predominantly Buddhist country. And what I learned in this process is that, yes, there's a peace education linkage that we make to Buddhism, but there's not really a peace education tradition within Buddhism. And it was amidst all this violence where they brought together these influential members of the Buddhist community, monks and nuns, to put together a Buddhist peace education curriculum to be taught in the monasteries and the religious schools. So we're going to do a quick activity around acknowledging those less aggressive members of our own lives and our own communities that have helped us reach our potential. So I'm going to ask you to think about to yourself, just 15 seconds or so. I want you to think about one person that you can actually reach out to right now, someone who's still living that you can contact through email or a text message or something, that has influenced you in positive ways, has contributed to your growth as a educator, as a teacher, as a peace builder, as someone committed to peace and justice. Who is that individual? It could be a friend, could be a parent, could be a colleague, but who is that person that you have gratitude for? Because they have helped shape the positive aspects of your life and your career. And I want you to think of that person, that individual. And I asked you earlier to grab your cell phone, your smartphone if you have one. And what I'm going to actually ask you to do is send that individual, even if you haven't spoken to them in months or years, send that individual a text message or an email right now, telling them that you're grateful for how they have contributed to your life in a positive way. So we're going to take 1 minute, 90 seconds. I'll give 90 seconds. It can be a short, simple message email reaching out to this individual and expressing the gratitude that you have for them. I have gratitude for you because ... So we'll take 90 seconds. We'll come back and talk about that experience. Okay, we'll take 15 more seconds. And if you need more than 15 more seconds, that's fine. You can kind of pause and come back to it later. I don't want to rush you if that's going to make it more difficult than it needs to be. Okay, so what we just participated in is something that has been studied by psychologists, particularly the field of positive psychology, where gratitude actually has, there's a reaction in your brain that happens when we first just think about what we're grateful for. That's step one. Just reflecting on it, just meditating on it. What are we grateful for? And clearing away just for a bit all the stuff that is frustrating, all the stuff that angers us, all the stuff that is just horrible. And even just for a minute, focusing on what we're grateful for. That's step one. Step two is getting it out of your head and putting it down on a piece of paper. Journaling, blogging, drawing, or something. Getting it out of your head and onto a piece of paper. That's level two. Level three is actually then expressing it to the individual that you have gratitude for. And then level four is potentially now there's some type of interaction. You have now impacted somebody else and they may then come back and impact you. There is a ripple effect when we do this. And in the span of 90 seconds, 2 minutes, you guys went from level one all the way to level three and now potentially level four. So that goes to the idea of what are things that we can do? What is one simple thing we can do that can, one, bust this myth and then actually leverage an approach that speaks to the science around acknowledging those less aggressive, positive members of a community. So myth number two that they looked at is there's this belief that war or any other violent behavior is genetically programmed into our human nature, right? It's just in our genes. There's nothing we can do about it. The reality is that actually when we create supporting environments and social structures that can reduce the likelihood that a genetic predisposition to violence will be actualized and increase the likelihood that a genetic predisposition to peace and nonviolence will be actualized. So there's an element of truth around how genes impact our behavior, but that's only half of the story. And what science has taught us over these last several generations is that there are aspects of your genes, or even if you are predisposed to certain behavior, certain environments, certain structures can flick those switches on or off. There are ways to condition how our genes are actually turned on or off or actualized. So an example is this organization that I work for. Simple example, organization here based in Washington, D.C. I'll place a link in the chat called One Common Unity. I've served on their board now for coming up on 6 years, but they do many things in schools throughout the Washington, D.C. area. But one of the things they do is they create these mindfulness practices within the schools. And a program that we started last year was intention rooms, not to be confused with detention rooms. So they would work with schools where there were, youth who were having issues with violence or arguments or confrontations. And instead of sending them to detention, which has little to no effect in terms of turning off that switch of a genetic predisposition, if you will, to violent behavior, is let's flip that switch. And they are intention rooms where they actually do meditation and mindfulness. And that has had a profound impact on those schools and those youth. Myth number three is there this belief that war is caused by some instinct or like single motivation. And again, it takes the control out of it for us as human beings. But what they found, the reality, and then the approach is that we can amplify and we can elevate cultural practices that counter the violence narrative and empower people to resolve and manage conflicts without resorting to violence. So this idea that it's an instinct is sometimes how we behave in many ways is in response to the options that have been presented to us and the value that is placed on those options. And if we can actually present more cultural practices that say, no, that's not strength, right? That's not what leads to winning. It's actually look at all these other examples that involve peace building, conflict resolution, and nonviolence. Now all of a sudden there's all these options. There are all these examples where as an individual you can say, oh, this is how I can respond. But oftentimes there's too many on the other side, and it leads us to believe that it's some instinct or single motivation when in fact that's not the case. So I'll share another link in the quote in the chat window here. This is a link to a podcast series that I used to produce and host when I was at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And that was the whole idea behind this, was that, was that there are all these peace builders out there in the academic field, in the activism field, in the NGO field, practitioners, and their stories just aren't getting out there as much as they should be. And how can we take this platform that we have at the U.S. Institute of Peace and actually extract these stories and share them more widely with individuals so that those examples, those options, those stories are now things that we can look towards and say, wow, look at the conditions under which this person was living or operating or working or teaching. And here's an approach that they took, and how can their story reveal options to us? So the link that I actually put into the chat here is a link to a specific episode on restorative justice that features an individual by the name of Dominic Barter, who works in the favelas of Brazil. And if you're interested in restorative justice and restorative circles, you're gonna eat this up. The guy is absolutely brilliant. I think it was one of my favorite interviews that I did for this episode. But by all means, go through the whole series and check out different episodes, and perhaps you can use some of them with your classes. And another event that we had at U.S. Institute of Peace was something called Media and Arts for Peace. And I'm going to share a link in the chat to the online course that was created as a result of this event. And the other thing I'm going to share with you is that all of the online courses that USIP has are being offered for free for the rest of this year. So I highly recommend going in there, registering for all these courses just so you can get in them before they cost something, start costing something again in 2021. And also just, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret here because I helped build these courses. I also recommend grabbing some of those videos. So if there are some topics, I'll put a link into the entire catalog. If there are specific videos or resources that are shared in these courses, extract them from the course so that you can have them for your own teaching and your own programs moving forward. There are ways to do that and get the videos so you don't always have to be going back into the courses or necessarily sending your students there. But that was those are some great courses to get those stories, get those examples that provide that counter narrative to violence and war. Let's see how much time we have left. So we're not going to watch this now, but I will share this link in the chat as well, and I encourage you all to watch this video afterwards. It's a video from Edutopia. Some of you are probably familiar with that website. A lot of great resources for educators, and they had a whole series on restorative justice. And so I'm going to share this link and another example of what it looks like to provide alternatives to violence and conflict, and in this case, in the school level. All right, the other belief is the belief that humans have inherited a tendency to make war from our animal ancestors. Oh my goodness, look at how violent this animal is being right now in this video that I'm watching on National Geographic. That shows us that humans have inherited this from our animal ancestors. So that's a total myth. The reality is that we can wage conflict and fight against injustice using nonviolent civil resistance. And in fact, it's more successful. And I want to emphasize that. That's one of the biggest contributions to the field of peace and justice studies in the last 10 years is the comprehensive study exploring, let's actually look side by side, violent movements and nonviolent movements. And let's not just say nonviolent ones are more successful because we want to think that. Let's actually study it. And what that study revealed in a book called Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Action, which won a tremendous amount of awards in the field of political science. It looked at over 300 nonviolent and violent movements between 1900 and 2006, and looked at their stated aims and goals. And these were movements that were being waged against what are considered the most intractable and difficult conflicts, against brutal dictatorships and oppressive regimes. Those are the ones that most people point to and say, yeah, nonviolence is great, but not when you're working against a brutal dictatorship that will, stop at nothing to crush their enemies. Those are the movements that they looked at. And they found in that study that of the violent movements in that time period, 26% of those violent movements were successful, meaning they achieved their stated outcomes. The nonviolent movements were successful 54% of the time. So yes, they still failed around half of the time, but the key takeaway from this is that nonviolent movements in those most brutal of conflicts were twice as likely to be successful when compared to their violent counterparts. And the book goes into detail about why is that? What is it about nonviolent movements that leads to more success? So I'm not going to go into that now, but again, it's called Why Civil Resistance Works. There's also a TED Talk online from Erica Chenoweth. She's one of the authors. If you don't want to read the whole book, you can look at the TED Talk and get the gist of it. And so sometimes what I like to do is just share some images of nonviolent campaigns and actions that have been waged all over the world and put those images in front of us. Because it's easy in the news and the media and the paper and television to put images of war and violence and bombs and missiles and tanks and guns and destruction in front of us. And those are the images of conflict and how to wage it that are seared into our memories. But what does nonviolence look like? What does nonviolence look like beyond just people marching in the streets? That is a powerful image, not to be confused with looting and rioting, but organized, strategic marching. But there are other images as well that we should sear into our minds. So I'll just go through this slideshow very quickly and then share a great link with you at the end to explore this concept more. So this was the Montgomery bus boycott, lasted over a year. These are people walking to work for over a year, miles and miles a day, because they made a conscious effort. I am not going to ride a bus that is structured around a racist segregation system. They won. This is in Serbia and Otpor. This is street theater, drawing attention around lack of freedom of the press and silencing voices of the opposition. They got super creative about how to grab people's attention, the general public walking down busy streets in Serbia. One of the more creative nonviolent movements of the past 20 years. This is a wade-in India to protest the building of a dam that was going to flood and destroy an entire community. And members of that community stood in the waters of their communities as the waters started to rise. And this led to what is called the inspection panel. It's something that the World Bank uses because of this demonstration. Now the World Bank is required, not a perfect institution, but because of this is required now to pass all these different safeguards and community involvement in putting in certain projects that have a negative effect on the communities where they're set up. This is alternative institutions. These are citizenship schools. The woman in the middle there in the glasses is Septima Clark. When Black people were denied access to quality education, weren't taught anything about their rights, civil rights and voting rights, well, you know what? We're going to set up our own schools. And those were called citizenship schools, alternative institutions. Hunger strikes. This is in Burma or Myanmar, predominantly Buddhist country. Buddhist monks are highly regarded, and part of the Buddhist tradition is you go and you ask for people to donate food. And when they were living under a brutal military junta and they wanted to bring an end to that, they refused to accept food from those who supported the junta, which is a huge, huge problem for those who practice the Buddhist faith. So this is a monk refusing to take food from those who were supporting the junta. These are leaflets and balloons and flyers. This is the border of South Korea with North Korea. North Korea, one of the most closed, brutal regimes on the face of the earth. can't hardly get anything in there. So what these activists, pro-democracy activists do is they inflate these giant balloons. They attach boxes filled with information about democracy, what's happening outside of this country, because they have no information to it. They wait for the winds to blow in the right direction, and they release them in the air, and the balloons fly over the border and land somewhere in North Korea. This is a blockade of the road here in Washington, D.C., I believe, raising awareness about climate action and climate change. Women to Drive movement, successful movement. Women were not allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, not allowed to drive. And so not too long ago, some women decided, you know what? I'm going to engage in civil disobedience and actually break a law or a custom, and I'm just going to get in a car and I'm going to drive around. And it spread like wildfire. Many of them faced consequences and went to jail for driving a car, but in the end, they were successful. Singing. Estonia, former Soviet republic, they brought to bring more attention to their ethnicity and their history that had been lost and swallowed and subsumed by the Soviet regime. They started hosting these large, massive concerts where they would sing these traditional songs. And sit-ins, this is the lunch counter sit-in. You all have probably seen this image before, to protest the policy of department stores not allowing Black people to sit and enjoy coffee or tea or food at a lunch counter. And these were Black and white students, young men, young women, who endured a tremendous amount of abuse for this act of civil disobedience. This is a sit-in and a teach-in in Chile, fighting for greater education funding. Students walked out of school. Some walked out, but some actually occupied the school and refused to leave until their demands were met. January 25th revolution in Egypt, obviously still ongoing, but this was worship and marching as another tactic on a bridge where protesters, security forces encountered each other, and the protesters began praying. Boycotts and picketing, the United Farm Workers Movement, addressing some of the most atrocious working conditions for farm workers and laborers. And of course, India and the Salt March, also an act of civil disobedience, marching to the sea at Dandi to reach down, collect salt, and make your own salt, which was against the law when the British were occupying India. The anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, public mass funerals to draw attention to the violence that plagued the Black community in that country. And then the last two that we'll look at here, humans have a violent brain. There's this belief, which is a myth. We can actually develop programs and educational systems that condition our brains to interpret stimuli in healthier ways and then respond with nonviolence. So mindfulness, breathing exercises, yoga and meditation, whatever you want to call it, prayer, whatever you want to call it, are ways to actually strengthen and condition the brain. Focusing on your breathing, and I'll share a link in the chat that you can watch later, but there are many programs that are spreading across schools to address stress, trauma, anxiety, all of these things that prevent us in many ways from reaching our human potential. And but by focusing on your breathing and being intentional about that, we bring more oxygen into our bodies. And our brain actually takes 20% of the oxygen that we breathe into our bodies goes to our brain. And so the more oxygen we can provide to our brain, the stronger and more capable we make it. So I'm going to end with a quick reflection exercise here, and I'm going to take us back to that opening quote, that we as a people do not yet have the world we are capable of having. And I want you to read and think about this quote again. And I want you to share one thing that you're going to walk away with from this conversation, and type your response into the chat. And I'll call on a couple people and ask them to share more about that reflection if you're called on. So you can, you don't have to write tomes into the chat, just a couple sentences. And then I'll call on a couple people to elaborate a bit on why they're walking away with that from the conversation. So I'll leave it to you now for about a minute, 90 seconds or so to type into the chat. Okay, great. Keep them coming in. I'm going to call on 3 of you just to elaborate a bit on why you wrote what you wrote. And so I'm going to start with Lena Chowdhury. If you could unmute yourself, and if you're so inclined, turn on your camera and tell us a little bit about what you're walking away with.
Yeah, I think you hear from, well, you know, what's been bothering me lately is that so much of the media, and I'm not talking about entertainment, I'm talking about fiction and books. Everything seems to be so negative and violent, like starting with Harry Potter, and that's not even that recent, but Harry Potter, Hunger Games, and now my husband and I watch a lot of Netflix, and everything's about dystopia. And I've been wondering, is that reflecting the reality that we all feel right now? Or is it just because that's what sells? Is it just a business model? So I like the idea that violence is not, it's a myth. It's not part of our human nature. It's not a natural state. You throw people on a deserted island, they're not going to naturally want to kill each other.
Great, thanks, Lena. And it reminds me, I had a conversation with my older daughter. She's 8 this morning, actually. And she has some friends in her school who are like, oh, you know, Kaya, I think you'd really like Harry Potter. And they really wanted her to watch the movies and read the book. And another friend was like, oh, Kaya, I really think you'd like Star Wars. And she has this aversion to violence. But I said, well, Kaya, you read, there's this series of books called, oh my goodness, why am I forgetting what the name of the series is? It's about dragons. Wings of Fire is what it's called. And there's all these different dragons, and there's some violence in there. There's definitely some killing in that series. But I was like, oh, well, Kaya, that's interesting. I was like, isn't there violence in the Wings of Fire books? She goes, yes, but those dragons, that's their character. Their character is they are a violent, like, dragon, whatever. But there are also these other dragons that's not their character. They're peaceful, like non-violent, and they don't ever fight or wage war. She goes, what I don't like is when there are people who are good, but then they're forced to engage in war. So she's like, in Harry Potter, yes, there's fighting, but it's like, yeah, but if you're someone who's supposed to be good and your character is good, why then are you fighting? Why do you want to be like revengeful and all this kind of stuff? And I was like, wow, this is fascinating how she was thinking about this. And I said, that's the crux of nonviolence. That's the dilemma, is like, how can I still be someone committed to treating people with human decency, but still fight back against injustice? Because I said, well, what happens if someone's treating you badly, Kaya? Like, shouldn't you be able to fight back? Trying to get to that conversation of there's a way to fight back without using the same tools and tactics that your oppressor is using. You can fight back without using violence, you know? So I feel like the gears were kind of turning in that way, but I just found it fascinating that she was like, yeah, I understand it's a fictional story and some characters, they're written to be violent, so okay, fine. But others, if they're written to be good and nonviolent, I want them to remain that way. I don't want them to fall victim to fighting and getting more. So anyway, all right, now I'd like to turn to Sarah Dorer. I think I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. Please unmute yourself, turn on your camera if you're so inclined, and tell us what you're walking away with.
I loved that gratitude exercise. I thought that was great. And I reached out to someone who actually you might know, Coleman McCarthy. He's like my first influence, right? I know, yeah, you do know him. He was my first influence when I was in college at AU in 2004 and 5, and that started me on this path. And so anyway, all that to say, I loved that the gratitude was in there, but reading this last quote leaves me with the feeling that the wording saying we as a people do not yet have the world we're capable of having makes me think of some of those cool distinctions that came out yesterday in our conversations about how peace, there are times where it seems like we have peace, but it comes at a cost, a significant cost to others as well. And it may be that there will always be that trade-off, but just to keep that in mind, that the world we're capable of having needs to be for us as a collective, not just for the people who feel like it's going great. And then other voices are just silenced on the sidelines. Some of you also know Coleman, but I'm glad there are people like that who keep working towards that and pointing that out, like you and like him, Daryn. Thank you.
That's awesome. Yes, Brother Coleman is also someone early on in my life. I saw him speak and I was like, who is this man? What am I, you know what I mean? So yeah, I've stayed connected with him as well. So that's great. And I love that you really highlighted that as a people, part of that quote. And then last, Marley, let's turn to you and you can share a little bit more about what you're walking away with. Yeah, Marlia, my apologies.
Oh, hi. Now I can't remember what I wrote.
I can tell you. So Marlia, you wrote.
Oh yeah,
okay.
It's challenging what could be. Yeah. So I know that I have to show more appreciation. I understand that about myself, and I have to keep reminding myself when I'm teaching my students as well to show appreciation for them. But I also think that this whole concept of acting on acting in a different way. I'm an anthropologist, so I've known for a long time about, genes. And then, after I finished graduate school, there's the epigenesis, where your behavior does change the way you are. And I really try to encourage all my students to believe that potential inside of them is the potential, unlimited potential of the universe. I like to use, microcosm, macrocosm, because we're, as an anthropologist, we have to think about how everything affects us. So, I try to really inspire in them the fact that dream as big as you can, and you might get some of them dreams. So that's what I'd like to say.
Marlia, that's great. That's great. So I'm gonna end it there. I know we only have about like 5 minutes left. I did share in the chat. It's the link to a shared Google document. It's got a bunch of links, including the one to the presentation. So feel free to take it, use it however you want. And then again, a bunch of other resources that I touched on. Some I shared in the chat, others I didn't, but they're all there.
Let's go 5 minutes for questions, even a little bit longer if we want to. We're not going to keep the trains always running on time. So, and Jess is fine with starting a little bit later. So just open your mics and raise your hands and put out a question for Daryn or for each other.
Yeah. And I'll stop sharing my screen here, actually.
Well, that's my question, Daryn. Do you think that the fact that all literature and entertainment now is all about dystopia, is that a reflection, or is that just what the business thinks sells?
Well, I think certainly it sells. I'm like a lot of other people where I love me some Game of Thrones. I watch that, and I'll have my healthy dose of, violent shows or whatever. But I think there's also a lot of really positive shows out there as well. The question is, are people turning to them at the same rate that they are of some of those other ones? But I think about a lot when I'm posed with this question. A student I had many years ago, his name was Rodney Scott. This was in 2003, I think, 2004. I was working for an organization called the Student Conservation Association. I was an urban crew leader. So I worked with youth, lived in and around the DC area, and we did trail building, conservation work around the area. And Rodney had an interesting life thus far, had issues, troubles, relationship, law, things like that. Anyway, brilliant kid. And he asked me one day when we're driving out to a campsite, he was like, Daryn, what do you think the world would be like if there was no music? And I was like, well, that's like a deep question. And I was like, I don't know, Rodney, like, what do you think? And, you know, he was like, I think that the world would be more violent, because he's like, I listen to some songs that are about violence or, you know, that are rooted in maybe anger. But he's like, I listen to them when I'm angry, and it allows me to process my feelings through someone else's music who feels something similar. And that allows me to kind of de-escalate what's going on in my mind so that I don't go out and act it in the world. That's not what I thought he was going to say, because my assumption was, just in terms of how I've grown up, is like, oh, music about anger or beef or violence, oh, inspires me to go out there and do that. But in his life, he was like, no, if I didn't have that, I wouldn't have that outlet to hear my anger expressed through somebody else. So I say that because I think maybe in some ways that could be part of the world that we're living in now, the desire or increased desire that people have to watch something that is around a dystopia of like, I'm feeling this way. I'm feeling like I'm living in a dystopia, and I need to process that by watching it expressed through some other medium. As a stress reliever. And I'm sure it's different with different people. But I always think about that question that Rodney asked me, and it surprised me, but like how he responded to it. Yeah, other questions or comments for the group?
Just open your mic. Go ahead and ask a question.
So it's been a great presentation. You know, we've all been watching everything that's been happening, you know, here lately in the news and the violence. But so how do you get the word out? Like some of the information that you shared with us today, how do you get that out there to, you know, the majority of people, to explain, hey, this is really how it works, you know? So we're not going to be successful if we do these violent acts, you know, how that makes us, you know, appear to people who are watching TV and they're seeing these things, and they may get a negative impression of certain groups because they see, you know, this negativity that's taking place. So, I mean, what would you suggest?
So I think oftentimes, like, we get overwhelmed, particularly educators working in this field, we get overwhelmed around like, I'm not reaching enough people. And our impact is, you know, maybe somewhat limited. And that can be demoralizing, I think, to a certain extent. And I think about a conversation I had with some DC public school teachers years ago. Were teaching peace education, and they were so invested in the lives of their students and felt helpless to a certain extent, because once those students leave their classroom and certainly leave the school, they go back into an environment, to a home, to a neighborhood, whatever, that these teachers really have little ability to influence. And a depression can kind of settle in, is like, I can never do enough to reach these kids the way that I want to. And what I always said to them was like, I don't know if that does any good for you. What you can control is what those students experience for the 45 minutes or an hour and a half when they walk into the door of your classroom and they have that 45 to 90 minutes with you in that space. And what you can control is, do they feel welcomed? Do they feel loved? Do they feel respected? Do they feel brilliant? Is it an opportunity for them to build and practice what it's like to be in a healthy relationship with a peer, with an adult, with a teacher, with an authority figure? Do they walk out of there feeling less stressed than when they came in? What they do with their lives after they walk out of that, we have little to no control. But we have control of what they experience when they walk into those doors and they sit down at that desk or they sit down at that table. And that's the approach that I've taken, is that at a certain point, like, I was there. I was like, I can't be in every home. I can't be on every street. I can't be in every school. And so I'm not doing enough. But if we all just realize, you know what, let me just focus on the things that I can, quote unquote, control, or rather, better word is influence. And if we all just invested our time into that, it will have an impact. It will have a ripple effect. And to have pride in the fact that, like, the moment that we spend with our students or the population within our school or our community or our college, let's be as influential there as we possibly can. And then pat ourselves on the back and feel good that like, yes, we're doing this work. Like I shared that resource, or we talked about this, or we raised this question, or we had this conversation. Maybe it was only with the 15 students that day, but that's 15 more than it was a day or a week before. And who knows what they're going to do with that afterwards. So that's kind of my response to that. Is the way that I do it is, look, I'm not at the U.S. Institute of Peace anymore. I don't work at an organization that its sole mission is on reducing violence in the world. I work for an education and training consulting firm. And I'll be honest, there was part of me that was like, oh no, am I leaving behind this part of my identity as a peace builder? And how am I going to respond to that? My response was, all right, I'm working with foreign service officers and foreign service nationals who are stationed all over the world. I've been given a gift where I get to work with people who are now working on education systems all over the world to create quote unquote quality education for children and youth. How can I bring my peace building lens, whether it's around social emotional learning, conflict resolution, some of these stories, how can I integrate that into the trainings that I design and deliver for USAID? And I don't apologize for it. So I will weave in those things that I think are valuable for people working in the field of education. And a lot of the work now in education across the world is education in crisis and conflict. And how do young people have an education when there's a pandemic or there's a civil war or there's a tsunami or you name it, political strife? And so I find ways to take what I hold as valuable and necessary when it comes to that quote that we don't have the world we're capable of having, the things that I know around the mythology around violence and war, and I incorporate it into whatever course I'm teaching or workshop I'm designing or you name it. So that's a long-winded way to answer your question, but hopefully I touched on it.
Let's take one more question and then we'll take a little bit of a break till Jess. So one more question.
I have a question. Daryn, thank you. I really appreciated your presentation. I really liked when you gave us the visuals for what does nonviolence look like. And of course, a few of them were more familiar than others. Like I really appreciated like the street theater for Serbia and the wait-in India. And I'm wondering, where can we find these images? Were they on the media site that you shared with us, or did you just piece it together?
Yeah, I kind of just put those together. I used to work for an organization called the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. I should have put that in the document. But so, I got intimately knowledgeable about a lot of different nonviolent movements. And so I just kind of went online and searched for images that went with those movements. What I would recommend is one of the links in there is in the Google document that I shared is the Swarthmore Global Nonviolent Action Database. And what this group did, it's faculty and students, they set out to essentially show and demonstrate that nonviolent action has been a global and historic strategy. It's not something that's recent. It's been around for generations and generations. It's not something that's specific to one culture that only works in one part of the world. It's all over the place. It's truly global. And they said, well, let's prove that by researching all of these nonviolent movements and campaigns. Now the resource is great because as an educator, if you're trying to find examples, be it an image or a tactic or an issue, or the types of individuals that were involved in the nonviolent movement, you can go onto this database and you can search in a variety of different ways to actually find a specific example that meets the teaching need that you want. And so I highly, highly recommend that as a resource to start thinking about what kind of images do I want to look for. But
That's
yeah,
great.
so yeah.
That's great. Thank you. It's the Swarthmore Nonviolent Database.
Yeah, Global Nonviolent Action Database. Yeah, you can Google that, and then there's a link to it in the Google Doc I shared in the chat as well.
It's great because we've all done these essays on nature versus nurture and the famous Mead and Freud debate, but everything is visual now.
Yeah.
And so I'm finding that in my peace studies classes, I've only been teaching the course for about 4 or 5 years, that I'm really having to transition from a text-based course to a visually based course.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
it's challenging for those of us who weren't raised on the internet,
Right.
All right.
All right, we're going to close it out. A round of applause for Daryn and his wonderful work. Thank you, Daryn. Daryn, if you can remember to put your email and contact information in the chat box. Sure. Let's give ourselves, because many of us have to get up and do our thing for a minute. I don't want to push us back too much, but we are probably going to push me back a good 10, 15 minutes to allow Jess to have her 45 minutes in question. But let's take a 2-minute break if we can, maybe 3 minutes, say 3-minute break. 3-minute break if you want to check out, grab something, restroom, whatever it is when you want to, and then we'll come back in 3 minutes. I'll introduce Jess and we'll go to the second and last session for today. So again, thank you, Daryn, for everything.
Thanks, you're welcome.
The wrappings, right? I remember.
Yeah, I don't need to check wrappings. I don't need to worry about where they got stuff.
So I think we're going to reconvene. Thank you all. Hope you got a little bit of a break. I went and actually got my lunch. So I got my tomato soup, which is my standard for lunch right now. So I'm going to eat while I'm listening to Jess, and I'm going to enthusiastically but gently introduce her and really turn it over to her. So as you probably know, I have an alter ego, and that is as president of an NGO, the Forage Center, which focuses on humanitarian education training. And this year, the program is actually being co-sponsored by the Forage Center, which I thought was something I've been wanting to do for a long time. And Jess is our director of education. She's also a professor at, is it Richard Stockton University?
Now it's Stockton University only.
Stockton University, New Jersey. Jess is an anthropologist, but her field is humanitarian training and education and criminal justice. And she's very active in the Red Cross. Maybe she'll tell you a little bit about her background. But she's actually working with us at the Forage Center for a number of years. She actually, when she was in a certificate graduate program, the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, she actually came to the Forage Center. We weren't even the Forage Center then. We were just running programs at Indian River State College. I don't make it too long of a story. And she came to that, and that was the rest was, that was the end of the story, or the beginning of the story, we'll say. We'll go from there. And so Jess has been our director of education. So I wanted to have a space where we could talk about humanitarian education and get us to think about that in the context of community college work and where there's intersectionality. So we will be going a little bit over today, probably till about 1:15, and then take a few questions after that. So I do apologize. I do like to keep the trains running on time, but and then after that, I'll say a few things, and then we'll be back together on Friday. So without any further ado, Jess, the floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you. So if you haven't, I put in the chat box. I know there was an issue with the link earlier, still trying to figure out all the Google Suite issues. If any of you are teaching and sort of are feeling this too. We do have a short survey. I've put the link on in the chat box. This is from the Forage Center, and it's basically just an idea of sort of the types of things that you all as educators, or if you're supervising educators, sort of the types of context you all are teaching right now, what's going on in your classrooms, how different concepts may or may not relate to your classroom. So we'll be covering these in the presentation. So if you're not able to do the survey before, you can do it after. That's totally fine. We just love your input so that we are putting our best efforts into that. So as David said, yes, my alter ego right now, with this hat on, even with the pumpkins and sort of everything else for Halloween, I'm the director of education and training for the Forage Center. I'm a volunteer, a staff member, and happy to do it. It's been a way for me to think about how education wraps into all of this. My day job, I am an associate professor of criminal justice. I'm at Stockton University, and I teach a variety of things in that having to do with humanitarian action, emergency management, which is actually how I got into this, homeland security, concepts of security. This semester right now, I'm actually on sabbatical, working on some research that I'm doing with policing in Northern Ireland. So I'm kind of all around the spectrum with a lens of thinking about how community concepts relating to peace building, conflict resolution, humanitarianism, all of these things wrap into different fields of practice and fields of theory. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. You likely also got, although if you did not, we can certainly get them to you. There were 2 short PDFs that were distributed. One was from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Assistance, OCHA, if you've ever heard of them. Just a PDF introducing the definitions of humanitarian principles if you wanted a cheat sheet. And then also there was a 2-page humanitarian competencies PDF that also went out that gives in more detail the things I'm going to be talking about. So you don't need to madly be writing things down or screenshotting or things like that. You've got everything. I just am going to be mentioning things as we go through. And of course, if you're missing that in some way, you can reach out to us and we'll be happy to get that to you. So I'm going to share my screen right now. You're going to see my these colors just made me so happy when I saw them. If you're like me and love the teal and orange and browns together, I just felt this to be a very peaceful cover sheet. So that's why I chose this. Although I'm always jealous when I see other people presenting. I'm like, that's such a great font. I want that font. So this is a fairly a traditional type of a PowerPoint, but I love seeing how others use theirs. So we're going to be talking today about humanitarian competencies, and we'll define what that is, and then also humanitarian work. And I want to be sure to sort of start now that when I'm talking about humanitarian work, it is not just the work that maybe you would associate with volunteers, for example, with the American Red Cross or the Red Cross societies around the world, or certain organizations. That humanitarian work and humanitarian principles and action, I'm going to argue here, are sort of a lens or a framework that we can actually introduce to our students no matter what we teach, within the context of our fields, so they can understand and potentially think about alternative or creative ways of problem solving using different lenses of understanding. So that's actually where I'm coming from with this. So you don't have to be teaching a class on humanitarian, like how to be a Red Crosser or how to be this or that. And in fact, when I teach my emergency management class, or you know, the large number of my students who are in my classes actually want to go on to be members of policing agencies, right? So what I'm really doing is introducing this to them, not only because they will need to understand it as they interact with people, but then potentially reflect on it in their own practice. So that's what we're going to kind of do today, and I hope it kind of makes sense when it's all said and done. And I'm going to be watching the time because, as you can tell, I am quite talkative. David and Lena already know that from working with me at the Forage Center. So some of the things that I sort of want to introduce with is that oftentimes when we think about humanitarian action, it doesn't have to be, but it's oftentimes in some sort of context of community conflict, and potentially as sort of one component in sort of a larger a puzzle of peace building, and things to kind of think about. So I'm not sure what you all teach. I'm sure it's a range of things. There may be some of you out there who are a criminal justice like me, or maybe you're doing a poli-sci or other things. I just thought everybody's here, so we're going to sort of do this over multiple fields. That when we talk about fields of practice and fields of theory, that's a false distinction. So I kind of want to put that out there, but I like to talk about it like that because, for example, a criminal justice is often thought about as a field of practice. It's also advertised by institutions as a field of practice, when it actually is also a field of theory, right? There's a theoretical background behind all of the things that we teach. And in some way, there's a practical application to sort of all the things that we teach. But sometimes our students come into the classroom thinking they're doing one or the other. I've had many arguments with students about how they shouldn't have to learn criminal justice theory because they're just here to learn how to be a cop or whatever they think that they're being, or a lawyer. And so something to kind of think about too is reflecting on how we begin to move our students' understandings into why theory and practice are also are very important. So thinking about things like when we practice things, we are part of the web of communities. I think it was Marlia said, so she comes from an anthropology background. My PhD is actually in physical anthropology. So I did a lot of the evolutionary anthropology, and my dissertation is actually on ancient lemurs, right? So I did a lot of community ecology work. And I like to bring that in, that we are all part of these sort of webs of communities. And when we do actions, when we practice in those communities, we are adding to larger sets of actions. And that when we think about theory, that also helps us understand why those contexts are in a place, and what ecology is, and what social living means, and what peace building, you know, how that fits into all of this. So you know, I always like to try to get my students to understand both. When we talk about humanitarian action, we're sort of grounding ourselves in this idea of what humans do for others, right? And necessarily, we're also talking a bit about, since generally there tends to be a conflict context, where is power? Where is power? How is it being applied? How is it being misapplied? How are people understanding those dynamics of power, and where the community is represented in all of that. So we're going to talk a bit about that. There's a definition I wanted to throw out there. I'm really big into defining things so everybody knows what we're talking about. And when we talk about crisis, so at the Forage Center, we often present scenarios of some sort of crisis. And it's like, well, what is a crisis? I mean, it's kind of like my next favorite word, disaster, which everybody uses, but rarely uses in the way that it's actually meant to be used. So sometimes we kind of confuse things. When we talk about what a crisis is, particularly when the way that we educate at the Forage Centers, is we're talking about a breakdown of familiar symbolic frameworks that legitimize the pre-existing socio-political order and entail a threat to core values of a system or the functioning of life-sustaining systems, which must be urgently dealt with under conditions of deep uncertainty. So it's basically, it's your breakdown of frameworks. It's your breakdown of an understanding of how things should be. Now, mind you, maybe that's necessary, right? So very often, sometimes the conflicts that we're dealing with where humanitarian action is sort of put into place is people are not only going through, they are experiencing suffering in some sort of way because of the crisis, you know, because of what's happening. But very often, those who are doing the thing to create the conflict more are in a crisis mode because the world as they think it's meant to be is not, and they're sort of pushing back on it until it's unsustainable. So it's important for us to kind of remember that not everybody experiences a crisis at the same time with the same experience. There are others who may be feeling a crisis all the time because the social context in which they live does not represent what it should, or does not represent what it, you know, they believe that it does, right? So for example, when we talk about equality in society, I mean, so many of my students, but Dr. Jess, we have equality. And it's like, really? So once again, part of my issue is not only having to deal with students who it creates a crisis for them to think that their world is not equal like they thought, while at the same time understanding that I've also got other students who are living in crisis because they know the world is not equal and they've been feeling the consequences of that. So if you actually think about it, there's multiple sort of frames of crisis going on that then intersect, right? So some may experience a crisis as a breakdown of the world as they think it should be. Others experience it as things like inequity or injustice, insecurity, lack of safety, discrimination, marginalization, disenfranchisement, all of the things that should not be, but are somehow in the system, right? So there's a lot of ways that we can think about how we use the word crisis and conflict. So when we talk about being a humanitarian, of course, you yourself can be a humanitarian. You can sort of represent humanitarianism. You can work for a humanitarian organization. You can have humanitarian principles. Generally, when we're talking about humanitarian action, we are talking about activity that in some way reflects 4 main principles. However, not all of them have the same weight, so we're going to go through them. And there have been some organizations, and there's a lot of literature on this. I'm happy to follow up if anyone's interested. I nerd out about it. There are certain principles that some organizations have decided not to include in their framework because they feel it does not represent humanitarian action, and we'll kind of get into that. But the main fundamental principle, the priority principle for all humanitarian work, is the principle of humanity, which sounds kind of, well, duh, Jess, I would kind of know what that means. Well, here is the definition. It's on that sheet that you got. So once again, you don't have to madly try to write things down. The principle of humanity is human suffering must be addressed wherever it is found. The purpose of humanitarian action is to protect life and health and ensure respect for human beings. So there is a primacy of unaddressed human suffering. Everything that humanitarian action or principles goes back to is the presence of unaddressed human suffering. Okay, so that really sets it apart from other things. So as we talk about your fields of practice, your fields of theory, what you teach, if human suffering is a part of that curriculum, you are entering into the world of a humanitarian lens, right? Because you are looking at suffering. And so once again, this may be a framework that some of your students really may lob onto as something, as a way that they'd like to make impact in their field. You can see there too that there's an inclusion of respect as a component of human suffering, that you can suffer also if not respected. And that's something that's taken some time to get into the principle, but that's also there. I think that that's very important. So any fields that address the practice or policy or theory of alleviating or reducing suffering in some way has the potential of being viewed through a humanitarian lens. So this is for you. So I'm pretty excited about that, because it's hard for me not to find a field that I can't apply something to. Something else to kind of think about as well is that part of this is also being reflexive, right? That you are not a humanitarian because I call you one. You are a humanitarian by the reflection on the principles, both personally and, let's say, if you're part of an organization or a group or something like that. You are a humanitarian by choice, thinking about how to apply these principles, not because you're created to be one, because we unfortunately have seen in the past where there may be, you know, an individual, an organization who believe that they're working under the big H, but who in fact actually violate those principles. So it is through reflexivity and through reflection and through continual self-assessment and organizational assessment that we maintain that, not because you're just considered something. The other 3 principles, and I've got a chart right after this to kind of show you. Once again, the next, and it's going to be weird maybe for you to hear this, but because oftentimes we think of these 4 things as being equal, but the next most important principle beyond humanity, so how do we address human suffering? We address it through impartiality. And impartiality, the principle is that humanitarian action must be carried out on the basis of need alone, giving priority to the most urgent cases of distress and making no distinctions based on nationality, race, gender, or religious belief, class, or political opinions. And I want to note here, these are all the definitions on that OCHA sheet. So if you're wondering what the source is and you don't see the little 2 there, it's all on that OCHA sheet. Main thing here, non-discrimination, and that aid or assistance, whatever that assistance looks like, be it sheltering, food, evacuation, all of these things is based on need. If need drives the system and need of, need to address a area of unaddressed human suffering, then sort of that's what's fueling the system. Okay. We do impartiality beyond non-discrimination. There are two other ways of also creating impartiality, or the best to our abilities. One is through neutrality and the other is through independence. So neutrality, and this is probably the most controversial of all of them, the one that people make to be very complex, but actually in its history is quite simple. Neutrality is that humanitarian actors must not take sides in hostilities or engage in controversies of political, racial, religious, or ideological nature. This is that you cannot claim a side, right? So if I'm wearing, or if I'm acting as a humanitarian, I cannot use my assistance to benefit one side over another. So you don't win sheltering, you don't win medical assistance, you don't win nursing, right? You get it by the nature that warfare creates suffering, right? Or conflict creates a suffering, and all who are engaged, all then are suffering. Neutrality, so there are a lot of, this could be, if any of you out there teach philosophy or teach political science or international relations or things like that, right? You could do an entire class on this probably, right? What is neutrality? What does it look like? Part of the reason why we sort of have this in here is for transparency's sake, right? That as long as you are transparent about what you are doing, because very often humanitarian action or humanitarian activities will in some way be used to demonstrate non-neutrality. Someone will say, but they're getting this and we're not, and therefore they're being non-neutral. And so it goes back to being transparent as to why certain actions are being taken. And as long as you can couch them in impartiality and humanity, you are going in that direction, right? But you have to be, and this sometimes is a conversation that sort of I have with my students, is that sometimes you do have to say the words, and I'll have an example here, that you just can't assume that people trust that you're neutral, that you have to say the words, and you have to say that you understand what they mean, right? Neutrality is in this system partly for protection of humanitarian workers, that if I am, like if you think about nurses on a battlefield, if one side or another thinks of me as someone who is helping the other side win the battle, I am no longer protected, right? So the principle of neutrality is also there to protect the very activity that we are doing as humanitarians. The idea is that if there is suffering on any side, that's what these individuals are here for. Finally, there's independence. Humanitarian action must be autonomous from the political, economic, and military or other objectives that any actor may hold in regards to areas where humanitarian action is being implemented. This one, again, so this is, once again, that humanitarian action generally cannot be sort of a given and or a taken away by a administration or by a this or that, and sort of be truly independent. That doesn't mean, for example, that different administrations at different countries don't have their own governmental humanitarian organizations, right? Think of FEMA. FEMA is the Federal Emergency Management System. Its job is to provide assistance when other states and or local municipalities cannot fill it themselves. They address unaddressed human suffering, right? But again, a transparency is they are a federal organization, right? But you'd be surprised, and again, this is what I teach, how much of these things are actually part of what FEMA workers learn, right? And so then there are times when ethically they've got to think about, well, what am I doing? And am I, demonstrating what I believe I'm demonstrating? So these are principles. These are things that, your students in just even thinking about how we interact with our communities and how we talk about it can be really interesting ways that you can delve into things like ethical standards, codes of conduct, all of those sorts of things. Like I said, not all of these principles are actually equivalent. That the primary one is humanity. It's unaddressed human suffering and thinking about what causes those. That those are addressed by being impartial. We are impartial in part by being neutral and independent. So once again, this could be a whole separate building into this, but once again, I just want to make sure that I'm not sure how many of you have truly delved into what these principles are, because a lot of peace building principles and peace building organizations and things like this are rooted in these different principles too. I interact with them all the time when I work on peace building work. So once again, when we're thinking about where we can apply this in terms of our own practice, right? Or we can apply it when we think about when we collaborate with other community partners, right? So once again, I deal with students, and many of whom are going into policing. They will interact with humanitarian organizations all the time. I live in New Jersey, hurricane area, right? And so it's important that they understand what humanitarianism is, what these organizations come at, how they make their decisions, so that there isn't conflict made when an organization says no, and you're like, why would they say no? Well, what did you ask, right? Did you ask them to break one of these principles? If so, how can we readjust that request? Theory and policy, if you're in policy work, if you're in poli-sci, if you're in sociology, if you're in law, other things, right? We always need to be looking at, do policies create human suffering? And if they do, how do we address those? And then also, if you're in a field where your students will be going out and working with the community, again, it gives us a framework to think about how different parts of the community interact with one another, different needs of constituencies, all of those things. So there is a document, and you got it, of humanitarian competencies. And I'm not, if you're like me and I'm at a 4-year institution, oftentimes we're asked what competencies, what professional competencies are your classes helping your students meet so that they can check off the box, yes, I've learned X, Y, Z, and that's why I'm going to be a professional in this field, right? There's a lot of issues with competencies, right? But I guess I've just gone positive with the beast that they are. And I said, okay, well, if we're going to learn these, then let's learn them and let's think about what's underneath them. And so there are, and you got the PDF, we're going to go through them. There are humanitarian competencies, and you might find the reason why I wanted to go through them is that there are core behaviors for each domain, and there's 6 domains that are put out there for humanitarian staff and then for supervisors. And I think you will find those core behaviors quite familiar, many of you, to some of the things you have to teach. And so once again, if you're thinking about if you're being tasked by your programs, by your departments, by you yourself, as to how to expand what you teach, particularly into community matters, into thinking about impact on community, these humanitarian competencies and frameworks may be very helpful to you, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Never reinvent the wheel. It's a wheel on purpose, right? Like, let's just do it, right? So I want to just go over very briefly. I've summed them all down. You've got the main thing, but for example, at the Forage Center, all of our programming is mapped onto these competencies, so that if you take a workshop, or if we come and do a lecture, or you watch one of our webinars, we tell you that we feel that by participating in this activity, your students have done X, Y, and Z. And maybe that's something that then you can report later. You can help your students when they build their resumes, all that stuff. Oh, right. Okay, so let's just go through the 6. The first one is applying humanitarian standards and principles, thinking about the context of how you work, who are key stakeholders in the communities, and practices that may or may not impact human suffering. So take a moment, think about what you teach. Do you ever think about integrating the voice of others who are affected by suffering or a crisis? Do you ever talk about the role of power, the role of organizations, coordinating aid, coordinating assistance, all of these things, right? This is that first domain. Secondly, there's achieving a result. I think this is in every framework of competencies, of professional competencies I've ever seen across most fields, right? So once again, our students learning how to be accountable, how to use their resources effectively and efficiently. Accountability right now is big in my field. And the number of discussions I have to have with students about why accountability is kind of assumed, right? Like, but you have to learn how to be accountable, right? That, I don't know if any of you have small kids, you all know that you've had to teach them how to be accountable, right? It's the same for professionals. What does accountability mean? What does it not mean? How do they report? How do they actively participate in things? How do they take evaluation and feedback? If you have students who panic every time they get an A-, this is that they've not learned how to take feedback, and they've not learned how to take evaluation in such a way that sort of they can build on their knowledge set. How decisions are made and who's accountable for all of those. So again, take a moment. If this sounds like something in your world that you teach, you've got this, and that there are ways through a humanitarian lens that you can help those students meet that. Two more. Developing and maintaining a collaborative relationships, how to be a collaborative. You know, once again, it's kind of assumed that everybody knows how to work together until you have group work. How many of you do group work? And you see how that, oh, I'm seeing some smirks, and it breaks down like that. Yeah. That's because Sesame Street says you're supposed to work together, but you've never actually learned how to do so. And so once again, a lot of your students are going into fields where they're going to be working in teams, they're going to be working with others, they're going to have to be accountable to others, last a domain, but create relationships and not screw them up. So once again, if any of what you do has to do with active listening, creating a dialogue, contributing to a team, learning about empathy and respect and compassion, all of these things, this is also a humanitarian competency. It's something else that you can sort of use and say, not only are you learning this for this reason, but you're learning it because there's a larger framework of understanding how we address suffering in our world. Operating safely and securely at all times. The Forage Center actually began long ago and far away because Paul Forage, our founder, who has passed away, sadly, but we still work in his memory, he was very concerned that students from the US, very well-meaning, were learning and wanting to sort of help the world. They go out into the world and then get themselves hurt or killed. Because they really went into a situation they didn't have full understanding of, kind of had their frameworks of what things are and sort of their standard of understanding how things would be, and then got themselves right into a situation where they ended up losing their life. And we've got some examples of those. And so also thinking about whenever we are doing what we do, particularly where there is conflict, are we doing things safely and securely for ourselves, but also for those who we are helping, or that we are assisting, or that we're empowering? Or are we creating actually lack of safety, right? Because we always need to be thinking about that. So if your field does, and not all of them might, mine certainly does, thinking about how you communicate risk and threat, how you reduce risk, how you reduce harm, how you can use things like independence, neutrality, impartiality, humanity as a way of creating a protection for whatever your students may be doing out in the field. That's something that's really important and that they need to think about and that they need to actively do. And finally, the last two, managing in pressured and changing environments. So your adaptability, your understanding of your own personal stress, your understanding of other people's stress, your understanding of adaptation and how people plan things and prioritize, what ethics means, all of that stuff. If you look at the core behaviors on that competency sheet, that's what they talk about. And finally, demonstrating leadership, right? David and I have often talked about this, that there seems to be this prioritization of leadership, and that's very important. We all should know how, if you're the person that needs to take on leadership, but we also need to learn how to be good followers and how to support the leadership as they do their thing, right? Because not everybody can be the leader, and we know that sometimes that creates a conflict. So understanding motivations and mechanisms behind leadership, behind planning, goal achievement, all of these sorts of things sticking in there. Once again, take a moment. If that's in your field, you're teaching also a humanitarian competency. So we can do these, again, this is not an advertisement for the Forage Center, but just thinking about largely how you might introduce things into classrooms, particularly now. Probably a lot of you are virtually teaching and you're struggling with how to engage your students over Zoom, which I am there with you. I feel that pain. Doing things as like discussion of scenarios, workshopping, a peer evaluation, right? Where they're really checking each other in terms of their own general knowledge and theory and things like this, right? There are ways to be able to do that and be able to say that you're practicing these certain competencies. There's short and long-term exercises, more of the experiential things where students act and do and yes, fail. And David and I often talk about that our scenarios, when we have long and short-term exercises, we actually want our students to fail there so that they don't go out into the field and fail someplace else spectacularly. We also want students to feel what it may feel like to not, a lot of our students, they're wonderful. They've got all the theory, they've got everything down, and then they try it and they realize, wow, this needs practice. That's why it's called practice. This needs practice. I'm wonderful, but I also need to do this. And so very often, if we can bring them through those opportunities where they get to reflect on their successes, but they also get to reflect on some of the things that they could do more effectively. I won't call them failures. We'll call them areas of opportunity for growth, right? Whatever the buzzwords are, we actually know what it is, right? And really thinking about how we create a sense of accountability for ourselves and for others. So here's, for example, maybe a discussion that I might have in my classroom. And I actually, here at the bottom, I began to brainstorm, and they're not all the fields, these are just the ones I came up with like in 30 seconds. All of the different fields where this scenario might come into play. So pretend, and this is where you can do a little bit of, in the chat box, you are a member of a humanitarian organization. I won't name it, just pretend that you are one of them, and all four principles you have in your mission statement. Your humanitarian organization is responsible for sheltering, providing shelter during emergencies. So let's pretend there's a hurricane, and so now they're sheltering. Your organization has decided to reassess what your registration forms look like. Right? So your current registration form, there's an area for gender, and it says male or female. And your organization has decided maybe we should add more options so that we understand more about who is in our shelter population at any one time. Your organization debuts the new forms, and volunteers get angry. And when they finally are able to express how they feel. Volunteers express concern, appearing as if this organization has taken a position on what they view as a controversial political issue. So they feel that gender identity is a political issue and that this now has created a lack of neutrality, because that's oftentimes how sometimes that definition is read. How do you think the organization can use humanitarian principles to support their decision in using this new registration form? I'm going to put the chat box here. So if you feel free, you can unmute yourself. You can answer through chat. How do you think? So here's a situation that might pop up in a lot of your work, as some of your students who are going into the field are having to think about sort of what are controversies in society and what are considered issues of this or that. Because I often present this and people go, well, yeah, that's non-neutral. They can't change that form. How can this organization, how can our students who might be thinking about doing similar things, how might they respond back? I'll take a second. I'll take a swig of coffee while people are thinking about it. Anybody out there teach a gender and think about a gender in societies and vulnerabilities it may create? Y'all are just wanting to get out. Okay. I understand. See, that's how it feels when your students do it. You're doing the same thing. So in the end, if you think about a gender, if you think about a class, if you think about any of the other identities that we have, right? If you think about it, we know that those identities may create perceptions of vulnerability that would create the feeling of what in people? Human suffering, right? So we already know from data that those with different, that individuals who don't necessarily feel like they can check a box of male or female, or feel that other people can, like, so a transgender individuals, when they come into and they feel the judgment of people at shelters or social workers or psychologists or sort of others, thinking about things like that, that response, or that the response that they may feel that they're getting from shelter workers may create feelings of suffering, feelings of vulnerability. Maybe individuals aren't sheltering because they feel like if they go, they're going into an unsafe environment, right? So it's kind of interesting to really think that part of what we have to think about, and here's where you can use the principles here, that actually, in order to address areas of suffering that we know is created by gender stereotypes, by assumptions of gender identity, all of these things, it is actually incumbent on the organization to understand more of that information so they can better assist individuals in an impartial nature, right? And address that suffering, and therefore create more safety, right? So there's a way that you can really take students through. It's one thing to put a definition down on a piece of paper and say, there it is, be neutral. And it's another to actually see how potentially the thought of, well, I need to stay neutral and out of gender politics, which one could argue if there really is gender politics, or if it is, once again, that's the way it's talked about so that people don't do things. It's actually incumbent on people to say the words, right? This does create this. It creates an area of suffering, and that's why we have to do what we do. So actually, it turns neutrality on its head. some of you, I don't know if you teach history or national relations or social services or things like that, you can even look at the histories of how we've tried, how frameworks of humanitarian assistance throughout history have tried to address human conflict and human suffering, like the beginnings of the ICRC, the Red Cross, right? And it's out of the Red Cross that we get the Geneva Conventions, right? Or we think about the United Nations and their role in the world, or treaties, or events of war, and a genocide, a disaster, pandemic. Heck, we're in the middle of one right now, right? And you can see literally our students working through the sort of idea about how do we assist, how do we help, where am I a part of that? What is my role in the community? What's my responsibility to the community? What is the community's responsibility to me, right? All of these things have blown up in a spectacular way, unfortunately, that really does demonstrate where these ideas can help our students create a lens of understanding. So even just looking at history, I'm a history nerd. So I always look back at history and say, let's look at where we came from to understand how we got to where we are. So hopefully, my hope here was to kind of introduce where, where the Forage Center for Humanitarian and Peacebuilding Education, how these things overlap. And when you're thinking about peace, you are thinking about ways in which people feel like their needs, their interests are in harmony and not in conflict. And oftentimes it's through humanitarian work that we try to address some of that. So if you teach in the concept fields or the fields of practice, it's all for you.
You know, Jess, I was thinking about, can you hear me all?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I was thinking about when you were talking about the forms and the issues of forms. I remember there was an issue in Virginia a couple years ago about, so we're having gender issues with forms now, right? That you have to pick a gender and now that's not so much of an issue. I think about the forms related to the census, the big issue about that. That is, there are certain categories that you would pick in the census that I wouldn't say would be a politicization, but in a sense would be more controversial for people to acknowledge than something that was less controversial. So it really made me think that this idea of neutrality and kind of completing like some sort of form is an issue.
It is, right? But the idea is that if any of those topics create areas of human suffering, create areas of vulnerability that result in suffering, it is up to the humanitarian to address those, right?
Mm-hmm. Right,
and,
right.
You know, that's part of the thing with the census is that many of our social issues in our local communities, we know what's driving them, but we don't have the data necessarily. And there are people who have absolutely pushed back and said, we shouldn't ask these things on the census because, you know, this shouldn't be here, or this or that, like I'm about undocumented residents, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But
so
we know those are areas that create real inequity and injustice and things like that in our community that then fuel other parts of community conflict. And so that while that some, and this does tend to fall on a political spectrum, may tend to say we shouldn't ask that because that's not what we're supposed to do. Again, in a larger community where community peace is based on who is feeling insecure at the time, if we have a better understanding of that insecurity, we can then create policies to address that and therefore address that human suffering. It's all about the need. It's not about the political view, but oftentimes politics is used to keep us from addressing human need. Does that make sense?
So, yeah. Other questions? Other question?
Finish up here, just a real quick.
Oh, okay.
I got done here. So,
okay.
Well, once again, feel free, you can reach out to us or think about using those competencies, in a way, if you're trying to struggle with how to give your students the skills that they can put on their resumes and say, I've practiced this in this way. These sorts of professional competencies, like humanitarian competencies, can be very helpful. It can also, if you think about if your students are going into fields where they may be interacting with those who are trying to act with this humanitarian framework in mind, it can help, it can be used for them to sort of say, I understand this. I understand what these things are going to sort of do, and that's why I, as a practitioner, am stronger in my own field, right? And obviously, there's also opportunities to engage your students in different types of learning modes, where they engage on a philosophical or an ethical issue. So that's it. Any questions, I hope, or any thoughts? I loved that the previous speaker asked, what are you going to walk away with? I would love to find out what you feel like you're going to walk away from this with, because I am a little different topic from peace building and conflict resolution, but I'd love, I think we'd love to hear, this is the first year that we've done this. And so, what you may have gotten out of this, or ways that we can develop this as a framework. Here are the sources in my contact info too, by the way. So David, I'll turn it back to you to ask for questions or anything else that anyone might want to discuss. I know it's 2:18.
Yeah, so any questions for Jess? You have her contact information. I know it's a little bit longer than we wanted to go. So I've got her PowerPoint, which I'll share with everyone. You have her contact information, so you can reach out to her directly through that. Yeah, I mean, we'll kind of go from there. So thanks, Jess. Round of applause for Jess. Thanks for the presentation. That was great. Gives us all something to think about. I think particularly those people who are dealing in career education, think about nursing, think about emergency management, and these are all things that are part of community college, is that making sure you're operating, or you're cognizant kind of the role that you're playing, right, in a humanitarian way, and the ramifications of that become really important. So we are basically done for the day. We did go a little bit over. Tomorrow, not tomorrow, no, there's no tomorrow, there is a tomorrow, but it's next Friday, we will be back with students. I will email you early in the week. Please take care of yourself this week. It is going to be a difficult week, not only for ourselves individually in dealing with what is going on with the election, regardless of where you stand politically. It's going to be a challenging week emotionally. There's going to be a lot of anxiety and stress, and certainly that's going to exist with your students also, right? And helping them manage through it. I would have liked to have a space to talk about things that we're going to do, but maybe this is a good thing. On Friday, maybe we can talk about what we did with our students and how they felt, because there'll be continuing feeling. And good heavens, we might not even know who's elected president by Friday, right? The way things are going right now. So it'll be kind of interesting for us to come back and talk about Friday. And Friday we'll be back with students also, so we can talk about with them then. Okay. Any final thoughts or comments before we call it a day? Anybody want to share anything? Okay. All right. I will let you all go. I'll close out the meeting in a minute or two. I'll let you all have a chance to kind of exit out, and I'll close it out. And then I'll get you out email early in the week, and then we'll be back together on Friday. So thanks. It was a great first day or second day, yesterday and today. I'm glad that you are all here, and we'll continue the conversation next weekend. So take care and be good to yourself this week. Okay. Bye.
Hey, thanks, David. Quick question.
Yeah.
Would it still be possible to include students even though at the outset I hadn't?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Why don't you email Catherine? You should have
Okay.
Catherine's email. So if anybody wants to include students at this point for Friday, the next 2 Fridays, email Catherine
Awesome.
at foragecenter.org, and then she can give you the login information for them.
Okay.
That's fine because they're students. We do want to record them though as registered, so we might still have them fill out a registration form only for our own
Sure.
records.
Yeah.
So we might have to do that. Okay,
Yeah.
great. All right. Thank you
so
all.
much. Appreciate
Okay.
it. Take care,
All right,
everybody.
all
Have a
right,
good
all
week.
right, bye-bye.
Yeah.